All
right, so we are now on the record. We are now recording, and tonight we are covering the last chapter of the first book of Samuel, the last chapter that we're going to be studying. It's not the last chapter, it's chapter 20. And we're going to talk about a very unusual relationship in the Torah, a relationship of two friends. Now, for those of you who have been with me from the beginning of our program, you know that the Torah describes all kinds of relationships. It describes the relationships between parents and children, between brothers and sisters. It describes the relationships between peoples and peoples. And oftentimes in the descriptions that the Torah gives you, you begin to discover that families in ancient times, in biblical times, were not unlike families today. They were somewhat dysfunctional, by which I mean that the Bible characters did not have problemless relationships, that their relationships were complicated, let's put it that way. So to take an example, if I were to ask you what was the nature of the relationship between between fathers and sons in the Bible, you could give me all kinds of descriptions. The relationships between, I don't know, Adam and his two sons, Adam and Eve and their two sons was Adam and Eve gave birth to two sons and they watched one son kill another. That wasn't a good example. You saw in the story of Noah, that Noah had three sons, and you see at the end of the Noah story how one of his sons, the youngest son, Ham, deliberately humiliates his father Noah and earns a curse from his father. In the stories of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the nature of the relationship between fathers and sons is complicated. Did Abraham love his sons Ishmael and Isaac? Yes, it seems as if he did. And yet Abraham banishes the one son and his mother from the household when he tells Hagar and Ishmael to leave and sends them out into the desert. And Isaac, he is prepared to sacrifice at the command of God. A very problematic relationship. You see in the story of Isaac and Rebekah, that Isaac favors his elder son Esav, Rebekah favors the younger son Jacob, and because of the favoritism of the parents, it produces conflict in the children's generation to the point where Esav conceives a murderous hatred against his brother Jacob and wants to kill him when his father dies. In the story of Joseph and his brothers, you see that Jacob himself, who takes two sisters as wives, takes Leah and Rachel. There are a whole series of conflicts between the two sisters. Consequently, the sons of all of the sisters and the concubines don't get along. And you have a situation in the story of Joseph where brothers hate other brothers and seek to displace them. So I think you could safely say that when it comes to familial relations in the Bible, fathers and sons or parents and children don't come off altogether well. The same is true with brothers. The first brothers we have in the Bible, Cain and Abel. Cain kills his brother Abel out of jealousy because God accepts the offering of the younger brother Abel and rejects the offering of Cain. Later on, we see that not only do the brothers Ishmael and Isaac not live together in harmony, but Jacob and Esau don't live together in harmony. Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers for a period of over 20 years. So you see a history of relationships between brothers that isn't exactly close. Even in the story of Moses and Aaron, though it's clear that Moses and Aaron do get along much better as brothers, they are two very different kinds of men. Moses is a very strong, charismatic leader. Aaron is a more pacifistic compromiser among men. And you see that even in their relationship, Moses gets angry at Aaron when Aaron agrees to the people's demand to make an idol, to make the golden calf. So I think it's fair to say that relationships in the Bible are complicated. And if that is so for parents and children and brothers and sisters, what does the Bible have to say about friendship? Does the Bible describe a non-family relationship of friendship between any two characters? It's an interesting question. Well, I'm going to ask the question. Do any of you know any stories in the Bible that describe a friendship, not a relationship between family, but describe a friendship between two characters in the Bible? Anything come to mind?
Well, I guess Samuel, this current story is
Okay, the book of Samuel. Which friendship are you thinking of, Michael?
Jonathan and David.
Okay. Jonathan and David is probably the only story I can think of. And it is not only the only story I can think of, it is the strongest story of friendship the Bible contains. There is no story of friendship as strong as the friendship between Jonathan and David. Are there any other two characters in the Bible who are not immediately or directly related who share that closeness? Does anybody know of any other? I know of one other. It's a relationship between two women.
Two women, I can't remember them. Was it Rachel? Is it Rachel and somebody else?
Rachel and her sister Leah were in constant competition with each other.
Ruth. Isn't it Ruth?
Wasn't it Ruth?
Oh, Ruth, right, and the mother-in-law?
Yes, Ruth and
Yeah.
Naomi, interestingly enough. They were not directly related. They were related by marriage. They were in-laws. Typically, mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law do not get along well together. But the only other idyllic relationship described in the Bible, interestingly enough, is the relationship between Ruth and her mother-in-law, Naomi. You'll remember in the story of Ruth and Naomi, when Naomi's husband and her two sons die in the land of Moab, and she urges her two daughters-in-law, Moabite women, to return to their family homes. Ruth refuses to leave her mother-in-law's side. She basically says, wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you wander, I will wander. Your God will be my God. Your people will be my people. Only death will separate us. So interestingly enough, the two closest relationships in the Bible are not relationships between actual siblings or even parents and children. It is between two people who are not directly related to each other, between Jonathan and David, as the ideal example of a male bond or a male friendship between two men, and Naomi and Ruth as a relationship between two women. I would add that there is one other relationship, which is a love relationship between a man and a woman. Romantic love does not usually figure in the Bible. In most cases, characters in the Bible marry for other reasons. Sometimes they marry for reasons of state. Sometimes a mate is chosen for them. You remember that Isaac doesn't even get a choice of who he's going to marry. Abraham sends his servant Eliezer back to the home country to find Rebekah, to find a wife for Isaac. There is only one story in the Bible that I can think of offhand where someone marries for love. Does anybody know what that story is?
I'm thinking Ruth and Boaz. Isn't that?
Ruth and Boaz marry. I don't know whether it's they marry for love. Boaz has
He had to marry her. Wasn't
he marries her both as a family obligation because she is a close relative whose husband has died without a child. He also admires her for her standing together with Ruth and her being faithful to her mother-in-law, and he is a kinsman. The relationship I was thinking of was the relationship between Jacob and Rachel. You know, Jacob works for 7 years for Rachel, and the Torah says something beautiful. It says the years were as a few days in his eyes because of his love for her. You know, for 7 years to go by to work for a woman, and it seems like a few days because you're so in love with her. That's a romantic relationship. And when his father-in-law Laban tricks Jacob and substitutes at the end of the 7 years the elder sister Leah, Jacob agrees to work for another 7 years for his father-in-law if his father-in-law will only give him Rachel as well. So it's hard to come up with relationships that are completely altruistic, that are completely based on love and on affection. But I think in the story of Samuel, we have such a relationship, and the relationship between Jonathan and David. So I'd like to begin by reading the introduction to the question I sent you. Of all examples of friendship described in the Hebrew Bible, there is perhaps none as exceptional as the relationship that existed between David and King Saul's son, Jonathan. In your reading of chapter 20, as well as in other earlier accounts where we've read about incidents before this describing David and Jonathan's relationship with one another, consider the following questions. Okay, so here are the questions. Okay, before I even ask question number one, let me ask a pre-question. How would you describe, based upon what you have read in the text, how would you describe, in your own words, the nature of the relationship between David and Jonathan? Does anybody want to try and put into their own words what that relationship was like? Can't be wrong. Okay, go ahead, Jerry.
Well, I would venture to say that Jonathan was quite taken with David's slaying of Goliath, and the fact that Jonathan, being a military man, it's a military drawn up on each hill. This Goliath is challenging everybody, and then this young man. I'm not sure how old was David at the time.
Tradition says David at the time of the battle was probably about 18 years old.
How old was Jonathan?
He was probably of similar age. Jonathan, there were two young men. They're described as young men, which would have placed them somewhere between the ages. The term that's used for a young man is more than an adolescent, but less than a full warrior. It would have been something between about 16 and 20, something in that area. It would have been late teens, early 20s.
So I think that Jonathan sees David as almost a twin, because it says that he was trying to have, he gave David his robe, he's given David some of his armor. So he was completely taken with his, what do I want to say, David's fortitude and trusting on the Lord.
Good. It's interesting, Jerry, you point out something very important. Immediately after David's victory over Goliath, Jonathan's immediate reaction is to feel a sense of kinship with him, to be close to him. As you put it, he gives him various items that indicate that David has found favor in his sight, his armor, his whatnot. It is clear David's military prowess, his whole behavior, his whole demeanor has won Jonathan's admiration. All right. So it is clear that from David's first experiences in the court, at least the first public experiences, we don't know what happened when he played before Saul, whether even Jonathan knew it, but from David's first public involvement with the court at the time of the battle with Goliath, Jonathan kind of, he was I don't know how to say it nicely, Jerry, he was kind of a David groupie.
Okay, now looking at the other side of it now.
Okay, go ahead.
I don't know the separation in time, but there was a point in time where Saul didn't find David in best favor, in fact, tried to kill him, I guess. And maybe David is now looking the other way and saying, hey, if I latch on to Jonathan as a buddy, as a, maybe he'll look at me like a son and won't try and kill me.
All right. We have to, what Mike is saying is, was the relationship mutual? Jonathan was he truly close to David and was truly close to Jonathan? What Mike is suggesting is there may have been a certain amount of calculation in David's relationship with Jonathan. Mike suggesting that perhaps after he fell out of favor with Saul, that David was looking to Jonathan as a source of protection. We'll come to that question in a little bit. But clearly, it seems to me, would you all agree that it seems like Jonathan is the one who initiates the relationship? Is that the way you all read it?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it seems clear to me that the first person to express admiration for the other is Jonathan, who expresses admiration for David. And as Jerry said, he does that by presenting him with various kinds of gifts that show that Jonathan is very impressed with David. Now, by the way, Jerry, you said something else which was interesting too. These young men, David and Jonathan, have certain characteristics in common. First of all, they're both young men. They are contemporaries, all right? So yes, Jonathan is connected to and loyal to his father, the king, but Jonathan and David are of an age, so they see themselves as compatriots. They're buddies. They're people of the same generation. What else binds Jonathan and David together? What other characteristics do Jonathan and David share that help to explain the closeness of the relationship between them? In what other ways, I guess I'm asking, are they the same besides the fact that they're both young men? Anybody else want to add something?
Well, brother-in-laws.
All right. Well,
They are family in a way, you know.
Eventually, right. Now, they're not brother-in-laws right away, Marlene, because even though Saul has promised his older daughter, Merab, to the man who will defeat Goliath, we see that Saul doesn't fulfill that promise. He gives the older daughter to someone else. Eventually, Saul will give his younger daughter, Michal, to David. And at that point, you are right, Marlene. Then in addition to being just two friends, David and Jonathan are brother-in-law. So they have that relationship between them too. Michael, go ahead.
Well, they're both warriors, and they both took initiative to enter a battle that nobody else would do for the people.
Very good. Not only are they both young men, they are both warriors. They are both brave men. And as Michael says, they both take the initiative to enter into conflict when everybody else is standing aside. You'll remember an earlier episode where the Philistines are gathering on one mountain and the Israelites under Saul are gathering on another. And Saul doesn't know what to do. He wants to offer up an offering to God and find out, check with God, will he be victorious or not? Well, Jonathan, his son, doesn't wait a second. Jonathan, you'll remember, tells his armor bearer, he says, you know what, let's go up and attack the opposite hill. And God will be with us. And if we get a sign, then let's go up there and initiate this conflict. Michael is correct. Both Jonathan and David are both warriors, and they are both rather audacious. I would not say rash. I would say both of them believe that God is with them. I mean, the thing that characterizes David is he seems to have this unquestioning belief that because he is fighting on God's behalf, he is fighting a war of the Lord, that God will be with him and will save him. And I think Jonathan displays that same conviction and that same courage when he and his armor bearer single-handedly attack the garrison on top of the Philistine hill, and together they rout the guard and set the battle in motion. So both of the young men share their youth. They share military ability and strength. Both Jonathan and David are accomplished in battle, and they both have a conviction that God is on their side, which gives them a form of bravery. Is there anything else that you see as go ahead, Jerry?
They both seem to have an appreciation for when they give their word, they stick to it, even if it may harm them individually. That's kind of the thing that I really noticed about both of them.
Yeah, and you could almost define friendship in these terms. Their friendship is not a matter of convenience. It is not a matter of what they get out of it. Their friendship seems to be on the surface a friendship of definite commitment to one another. And the only thing they have to really bind that friendship is their word. It seems as if they take vows to one another very, very seriously. Even when, as we will see, Jonathan is going to pay a price for his friendship with David, his friendship does not seem to waver. He does not seem to question the price he is going to pay. Even though he is going to have to stand against his father in defending David, Jonathan takes his oath very, very seriously. And so too, for his part, David, both in the stories that we've read up until now and we will read tonight, but later on, especially in fulfilling the vow that Jonathan causes him to make between their two households, David very faithfully follows his promise to Jonathan that he will watch over Jonathan's seed and Jonathan's descendants. David is very, very committed to honoring all the promise that he has made to Jonathan. So both David and Jonathan are men of integrity. They're men of their word who bind themselves together with an oath before God that ties them one to another. Okay. Anybody else? I think you've done a great job in analyzing it. These are two men clearly who both share some very, very important characteristics. All right. So let's now turn to my actual questions that I asked. Question number one we already answered. Who do you think initiated the friendship? and the eventual covenant between these two young men. And I think we've agreed that it was Jonathan who initiated the friendship. Why would it be natural for Jonathan to be the one to initiate the friendship? Why did Jonathan seek David out as opposed to the other way? Anybody have a thought about that? Go ahead, Michael.
Well, I don't know if it'd be natural for Jonathan to do it, but it'd probably be improper for David to do it. You don't go up to Prince and say, "Hey, Prince, would you like to be my friend?" It's not a normal way things are done.
No, we call that kind of a relationship, Michael, we call that fawning. If David had made a big deal about Jonathan and said, "You're my bestie, I'm going to love you forever," we would have said that David was taking a fawning attitude toward Jonathan, that he was trying to get himself into the good graces of Jonathan. He was doing it for an ulterior motive. It would not have been proper, Michael is suggesting, for David to have initiated the contact. Jonathan was the son of the king. He was the man who was next to the seat of power. If a proffer of friendship was to be made, it had to come from Jonathan, properly speaking. Once Jonathan offers friendship, offers recognition, David can reciprocate in kind. But it would not have been proper, and I agree with you, Michael, I would not have been proper for David to have initiated the relationship. It would have been Jonathan's right and Jonathan's prerogative to express his admiration. And after all, it was David who had just performed this formidable deed. All the rest of the camp Israel had cowered at the challenge of Goliath. No one would even think to face this giant. And here this young boy goes forth, and not only does he face the giant in man-to-man combat, single combat, he defeats him. It's natural to understand why Jonathan was so admiring and so in awe of what David had accomplished. All right, number 2. What are some of the practical disadvantages of Jonathan's attitude toward David? You know, friendship is tested by what price you have to pay for friendship. If friendship never makes a demand on you, you never know what a true friendship is worth. A true friend is a person who is going to be your friend and is going to be by your side for good or for ill. A true friend is willing to pay a price and stand by you even when the going gets rough. What price does Jonathan, Saul's son, what price does Jonathan pay for maintaining his friendship with David? Maybe someone who hasn't had a chance yet to would like to. Go ahead, Esther.
Well, Saul threatened him already to kill him because of his friendship.
Good. And even before, Esther's right, even before Saul actually physically threatens Jonathan, he makes it clear to Jonathan he has no great love of David. You know, by the way, this Saul is a very interesting character. He doesn't reveal his full intentions right at the beginning. He tries to cloak them, which is consistent with Saul's paranoid nature. On one hand, Saul has forced to admire David's prowess and his ability and the help he gives to the Israelite army. On the other hand, Saul is extremely jealous of David's success, and he sees in David a rival who will threaten his own title to kingship. So Saul has to play a very tricky game. At first, he tries to make a pretense of favoring David. David, you're wonderful. You've done this wonderful thing. I'm going to make you the head of my military. I'm going to make you a military leader in my army. And we already see that part of Saul's reason for doing that is the thought that maybe the Philistines will knock David off. Maybe the Philistines will take care of David, so he won't have to do the job. As David becomes more and more powerful, Saul becomes more and more incapable of hiding his true intent. Sometimes when Saul is in one of his moods, he lets his temper get the better of him. You'll remember the first time David was playing a harp before Saul. Saul was in a foul mood. He was in the midst of his melancholy, and he has a spear in his hand, and he takes the spear and he brandishes it, whether he throws it or he just menacingly shakes it in front of David. David initially thinks, it's just Saul in his mood. But as Saul goes on, his intentions become clearer and clearer. At first, it seems like he just does it in moods. And then it seems like he does it more frequently. And then it seems like he tells other people to do it for him. He tells the servants, go bring me David. Slowly he goes from plotting quietly to outright telling people, I want this son of Jesse dead. I want the man dead.
Well,
Okay.
wouldn't we have had that same expectation without the further, story telling of the story of the thousands and the tens of thousands? I mean, anybody who said, yeah, I'm going to go up and kill the Philistine, wouldn't Saul have had the same relationship to that person at that time, saying, this guy is going to be really much better than I am, and I better kill him. I mean, so it didn't matter that David further now comes along and gets the appreciation of the population at that point.
That's right. The appreciation of the population, Mike, was only evidence that not only did Saul recognize David's popularity, but the people did. It was another negative. Not only did Saul recognize the danger David posed, but he saw how popular David was with the people, and he feared that David would replace Saul in the affection of the people. So on the one hand, he sees David, he's jealous of his abilities. On the other hand, he sees that David is more popular with the people than even he is. And then he sees that even in his own family, his own son, his youngest daughter, loved David. It seems like Saul's servants, his household, people, no one can help being caught up in the charisma of David. So you're right. It probably, even if they hadn't come up with that song, Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands, Saul would have been right to fear David. And as we talked about last week, it was not delusional. Saul already knew, because Samuel had told him earlier, God has taken the kingdom away from you and given it to one better than you. So Samuel was already prepared for the idea that he was going to lose his kingdom to another. No sooner does David appear than David is successful, David is popular, David wins the affection of everybody around him, and Saul becomes growingly angry. So he reaches a point where finally he can't hide it anymore, as Esther says. He says to his son, why are you establishing a friendship with David? Why are you so close to this guy? Don't you see that he threatens your future position, Jonathan? Can't you see which side the bread is buttered on? What is Jonathan's response to Saul's warning to Jonathan that he should be careful of David? How does Jonathan respond to Saul's warning? Anybody? What is Jonathan's reaction?
It's friendlier with David, gives him all the armor and all the other stuff.
Yeah, he seems to only come closer to David. He says, my dad seems to not like you too much. My dad seems to have harbored some kind of a thing about you. Let me talk to my dad, because it doesn't make any sense. Why should he feel that way? Jonathan only sees David in positive terms. You're in his army, you win his battles. When you win his battles, his kingship is strengthened. Jonathan doesn't see what Saul sees. Jonathan only sees how David increases Saul's influence and power, okay? But Saul sees something that Jonathan doesn't. He sees an adversary. So when Jonathan speaks on behalf of David and he says to his father early on, why are you angry with David? What has he ever done to you? Has he ever harmed you? Has he ever lifted a hand against you? Has he ever spoken against you? Has he ever made any attempt to seize power or influence for himself? King Saul is forced to admit, you're right. You're right. I have nothing in particular. There's no specific charge I can lay against David as to why I'm, afraid of him, why I'm angry with him. David has you're right. David has done nothing for which he deserves death. And when Jonathan initially goes back to David after Saul seemed out of sorts with him, Jonathan says to David, it must be my father's moods. My dad, how he gets in a mood. Because I talked to him, I laid it out straightforward, and my father said, no, you're right. David is a worthy man. He deserves to live. But then, of course, David continues to get more powerful. David continues to enjoy success. And finally, after a few more attempts, Jonathan cannot hide from the fact that Saul intends to kill David. I think the real obvious attempt is when Saul sends servants David is with Saul again, and Saul is angry and he throws a spear again, and David escapes. And then David attempts to hide himself. He attempts to stay away from, I better keep away from my father-in-law. It seems that there's something about my face he doesn't like. And every time I appear before him, I get him angry. So I'm going to stay home for a while. I'm not going to go to, the palace. I'm going to stay in my house and stay away from my dad. So after a while of absenting himself, what does Saul do? He sends 2 messengers to David's house. David, by this time, is married to his daughter, Michal. And he says to his messengers, I want you to go to David's house, and I want you to bring him to me. And we get the idea that Saul intends to bring David to him to kill him, okay? Now, somehow, David's wife, Michal, understands what's happening because she is the one who informs her husband. This is in an earlier chapter. She says to David, my father, for whatever reason, is seeking a pretext to harm you. And if you don't get out of the house now, you won't be alive by tomorrow morning. She conspires with David to get him out of the house secretly because Saul has sent messengers. Saul doesn't want to do the deed in the house. Saul has sent messengers outside of David and Michal's house with the idea that when David goes out for the day or goes out, the messengers will take David and they'll bring him to Saul and Saul will kill him. When Michal realizes what's going to happen, she tells David, my father is seeking to kill you. You better get out of the house, sneak out of the house. And there must have been a way that she got him out of the house without Saul's messengers seeing him. Finally, when the messengers go back to Saul and he hasn't come out, Saul sends them back again and he says, no, this time, because Michal says he's sick, he can't come to. Saul says, I don't care if he's sick. Go to his bedroom, bring the boy, bring him to me. The messengers go into the house, they go to David's bed, and what they find lying in the bed, they find these teraphim, these figures wrapped in the bed. It's kind of like, what we did as kids. We put something in our bed when we wanted to think, our parents to think we were in bed, and we made the bed look like we were lying in it. So the messengers bring back the bed to Saul, and I guess Michal, the daughter-in-law. And Saul says to his daughter, what have you done? Why have you allowed this man, your husband, to escape? And Michal comes up with some kind of a story. Well, I didn't want to let him escape, but when he learned that there were messengers, that he learned his life was in danger, he forced me to let him go. At this point, Jonathan should have known that David was in trouble. At this point, Jonathan should have realized that his father was seeking David's life. And actually, it was at this point, Jonathan does endanger himself. He says to David, look, you hide yourself. I'm going to go into my father. I'll see what his true disposition is to you. And if his thought is to kill you, trust me, I'm going to tell you the truth. Okay. Now, David's life is in Jonathan's hands. I just want you to understand this. David's life is in Jonathan's hands. If Jonathan had come back and said to David, had lied to David and said, no, my father is fine with you. It must be your imagination. If Jonathan had covered for his father and David had returned, then David would have been killed. It is a sign of the trust between Jonathan and David that David trusts that Jonathan will return a true report. They swear to each other, and Jonathan says, look, if my father intends to do you ill, I'll let you know. If my father's intention toward you is only good, I will let you know, but you can trust me that I will tell you the truth. And David believes him. And they even come up with a code. Did you get the code? This is this chapter. Jonathan says, I'm going to go talk to my father. And if my father decides you're to live, I'll communicate that with you. And if he decides you're to die, I'll communicate with that with you too. Now, it's not hard if you live. If Jonathan's father decides, if Saul doesn't want to kill David, Jonathan could just meet David and say, it's okay, David, come on, my father has no ill will to you. But if Jonathan realizes that his father, Saul, wants to kill David, he's got to somehow get the word out to David. So he contrives this going out the following day, going out with his armor bearer, chasing arrows. And he creates a code by which David will know what his father's true intentions are. All right. So Jonathan risks his own life for David's sake. Saul is so angry at Jonathan, we get the impression that in his rage, he could have even harmed his own son. He thinks his son is foolish. He thinks his son is risking his own kingship and his own family's future by having a stronger bond with this stranger, this man, David, than he does with his own family. Let's see. At this point, you have to ask yourself, why did Jonathan stick with David? Everything has to tell you that his advantage was not sticking with David, okay? If he had been at all political, he would have realized that David was growing in favor. He would have seen what his father was afraid of. But Jonathan was so completely taken by David that he could not see what his father clearly saw, the danger that David posed to Saul's rule. Do you think Jonathan was deceived, or do you think something else? How do you explain that relationship of Jonathan to David? Anybody? Go ahead, Esther.
It was probably the covenant they made between themselves, like this,
Okay,
the friendship to be there.
yeah. The bond of covenant, which is a very strong one, stronger than anything we have in our current society. It's more than just a blood brothers. This was an oath that they swore between themselves and their families and their futures. This was a strong one. The strength of that vow, the strength of the commitment to one another that caused Jonathan and David to make that vow to one another was so strong that even in the face of the possible danger to his own future, his own career, his own political future, Jonathan places his relationship with David on a higher level than his ambition to be king. Okay? I think you're right. I think his relationship with David, his commitment to David, and maybe even his belief that David was the right man to rule Israel, his recognition of the defects of his own father, all those were motivators in causing Jonathan to stick to David and to remain loyal to him. Does anybody else have any other ideas? Does anyone else think that David was just such a great manipulator and user of people that he had Jonathan wrapped around his little finger? Is anybody so cynical as to suggest that maybe David read Jonathan correctly and he knew him? Okay, good. Okay, which leads me to my fourth question. Do you believe that David was as genuinely devoted to Jonathan as Jonathan was to David? Or do you believe that David had ulterior motives
That's what I said earlier.
relationship he did with the young prince? Go ahead, Mike.
That's what I said earlier. I thought that David saw that it would be better for him to be close to the king's son and therefore not be an enemy of the family.
Okay. There are a lot of people who read David that way. I've told you there are two ways to read David: as an idealistic young man and as a political conniver. Okay. And both ways can be read in this story. Okay. David, the idealist, David, the man who believes in God, David, who believes that with God on his side and the knowledge that God has chosen him to be the anointed leader of Israel, that David has all the faith in the world, and David is altruistic and he will never lift up his hand against Saul, because after all, Saul is anointed by God, and David will do nothing to hurt Saul, and God will, in his own good time, if he wants David to be king, God will arrange it. That's the idealistic David. But then there is David the conniver. Now let me paint another picture for you. If David really believed that he was and knew that Saul and that Samuel had anointed him to be king in place of Saul, then from the very beginning, David knew something which we're not certain he knows. If he knew that, then David knew that he was destined by God to replace Saul on the throne. Did David know it? I don't know. I can't tell you. And anybody who reads this text can't tell you either, because it is not clear whether or not Samuel revealed that to him. Michael, go ahead.
So if David were a conniver, why would he wait in the field for Jonathan to come back and say, you know what, my dad is actually going to kill you? Why would David not go out and start the plot in motion 3 days earlier, or however many days earlier it was. I mean,
All right.
it seems like he had opportunity for a head start right there.
Okay. So if David is a conniver on that theory, let's follow his development. Michael's question is, can we plot a course of David the conniver that explains the story up until this point? All right. So David, who knows that he is favored by God, comes into the Israelite camp when this giant named Goliath is making these boasts. Okay. I'll fight whoever you want to fight against me. Pick your best man. You pick your best man. Let him come man to me, and we'll meet in the field of battle. David, either because he's sure of himself, either because God has singled him out or because he knows he's good with a sling or whatever, David starts spreading in the camp the words, why is everybody so scared of this guy? Why is nobody standing up for the God of Israel? Why is everybody letting this uncircumcised Philistine oath curse and deprecate our God? Someone should stand up to him. And he keeps opening his mouth until finally word gets to Saul. There's a young whippersnapper in the camp named David who's saying, why isn't anybody going out to meet this guy? If no one else will do it, I'll do it. So David, the conniver, gets himself called in front of Saul, and Saul says, young man, are you out of your mind? This guy is a man of battle. He's a seasoned warrior. You're pretty much a nothing. You're a shepherd. You tend your father's flock. He's going to kill you. And David, being kind of a boastful guy, says, well, you may see me as just a shepherd, but you don't know what I can do. When I was shepherding in my father's fields, there were bears and lions who used to attack the flock, and I used to save the flock from their hands. And they would sometimes charge me, and I would sometimes have to go into combat against them, and I can do it. And so David is touting himself. You may think that I'm not equipped to do it, but I am equipped to do it. And what's more, if God is with me, then I have no fear. So Saul at that point says, fine, you want to commit suicide. He didn't say that, of course. Go ahead. Here's my armor. And David says, no. Your armor's not going to help. I'm just going to go out and face this guy mano a mano. He goes out to Goliath. He's carrying his staff. Goliath is insulted. What are you trying to insult me? You're coming at me like I'm a dog. Goliath runs toward him on the field in heavy armor and with his spear and his lance and his javelin, with everything on him. And David takes a sling, hits him below the helmet, stuns him, and then takes Goliath's sword and kills him. All right. Now David has got fame. All of the Israelite camp, remember, this is done before all of the Philistine camp and the Israelite camp. Not only did the Israelite warriors, Saul's warriors, know of David's feat, the enemy flees. Israel is given a great victory. In the aftermath of that victory, David is in a perfect position. As a matter of fact, he could have, if he had wanted to, said to Saul, he could have turned around and said, okay, Saul, you said that the person who defeated this champion would get his daughter. I'm claiming your daughter. Why do you think, if Michael is right, if David was a conniver, why didn't he claim the daughter right then and there, Michael?
Well, that's just it. I mean, I was asking why David, how the conniver story works.
All right.
Okay, so later on, though, he did get one of the daughters.
Right.
And that was pretty much all he would get from Saul there. And when he had to leave, then why didn't he stay out and start his plot towards taking over the kingdom then? Because he got nothing by staying later.
Let's follow his story. Let's follow Michael's plot. All right. So David succeeds in defeating Goliath. He could have demanded the girl right away, but that might have looked a little opportunistic. It might have looked like he was, doing it for the girl. So after he defeats Goliath, what does Saul immediately do? He elevates David. He makes him a leader in the army, right? And in that capacity as leader in the army, David goes out at the head of troops and he does battle. And perhaps his father-in-law figures, look, this brash young guy's going to get himself killed. I'm not going to do it. The Philistines will do it for me. But lo and behold, David not only goes out at the head of Saul's army, but he keeps winning victories. So much so that David, and he must have been in the front of battle, because the women said, Saul has slain his thousands, but David has slain his tens of thousands. You don't get that reputation if you're staying back, Michael, at the back of a camp, waiting for the armies to do battle. David must have been one of these guys who was rushing in with the army into battle. So David was in battle, and after these battles, and his fame grows, then Saul, at the time when you would have expected him to give him Merab, the older one, Saul goes ahead and he doesn't give him Merab. And you know why Saul doesn't give him Merab. The last thing you want to do at this point, if you're Saul, is give him your eldest daughter. What Saul does instead is he gives the elder daughter Merab to another nobleman, another person in the army. And he says to David the following: look, I know I said I would give Merab to the man who defeated Goliath, but you don't have the status for that. I gave her to someone else, but I'm told that my younger daughter, Michal, loves you. It turns out that my men have told me that she has taken a fancy to you. So I'll tell you what, if you can't be my son-in-law through the older one, be my son-in-law through the younger one. And David says, all right, I'm willing to do that. He says, but I haven't got any money to pay the bride price. In other words, I'm just a shepherd. I come from a Bethlehemite family. I'm not going to be able to pay the bride price. And so Saul very cleverly says through his servants, tell David, I'm a king. I don't need money. What's a bride price? Tell David if he gives me 100 Philistine foreskins, I'll take that as the bride price. Okay. He doesn't have to pay me money. He's not a man of money. Let him go out into the field of battle. Let him kill me 100 Philistines and bring back the trophies of his battle. In the Wild West, we brought back scalps. In Israel, they brought back foreskins. I guess it's better to fight in the Wild West than in the than in the ancient Israelite army. I don't know. Anyway, Saul says, bring me back 100 foreskins as signs that you've slain 100 Philistines. And for the price of 100 foreskins, I'll give you my younger daughter. And by the way, this wasn't in a battle, a military. David has to do this on his own. This isn't like in a battle of Saul's army. David's got to engage the enemy. So we're told that David and some of his men go out and they not only kill 100 Philistines, they kill 200 Philistines. And they bring Saul a bonus. They bring him 200 Philistine foreskins. At that point, Saul has no choice. He's got to give David Merab, and that's exactly what he does. For 200 Philistine foreskins, David is given Merab. Now, we know what happens afterwards. Saul still isn't happy with David. He tries to kill David. He gets angry at Michal because she tries to protect him. At this point, David realizes he's not safe in Saul's presence anymore. Now, Michael's question is a good one. Why does David trust Jonathan in chapter 20 to go and speak with Saul, his father? Why doesn't David just take off, as Michael says, and gather his men and begin the revolt right away? Does anybody want to respond to that? There is a reason. Go ahead, Michael.
Well, I mean, my take was it's because he's not a conniver and he's a genuine trusting person, and he has this friendship, this bond, this covenant with Jonathan. They've been together. They've been in battle together. They've been around each other together. Jonathan's his brother-in-law, and he's got some bond enough to trust him. You trust this guy in combat, you're going to trust this guy in life too. But if you're a conniver, which was the other story you were trying to play, I think you would just get out of there and start, executing your plot that you've been working on.
All right, so I'm going to try and now state my case, Michael. David rightly knows that Saul wants his life. David is astute. Jonathan is not. David understands why Saul hates him, okay? Jonathan can't see through his love of David, the danger David put Saul in. But David knows, and David trusts Jonathan. He knows that if Jonathan goes to his father and his father reveals his true intentions, David knows his father is going to tell him that he wants David killed, okay? The reason that David would do that and go through this process rather than just run away is that by having Jonathan go and raise the issue with Saul and believing that Saul will make his intentions plain, David can then later say he exhausted every possibility before he turned away and rebelled, okay? I didn't turn on Saul. I feared he was after my life. I believed he hated me. I believed for whatever reason that he wanted me dead. But my friendship with Jonathan convinced me not to make a final judgment. I agreed to allow my blood brother, my friend, my bonded friend, to go and to plead with my case before his father. And when his father responded to him in the way that he did, then I could in good conscience agree to flee and escape from Saul without fearing that I was abandoning my post or that I was turning on my king, because it had been made abundantly clear that Saul sought my life. You see, it's the final proof, Michael, that David had exhausted all the possibilities. He could not be accused of raising a revolt against the legitimate king. That's the way I read it, okay? He had nothing to lose by allowing Jonathan to go to Saul. Does that persuade you at all?
Not really, because I think if David left earlier, Saul still would have sent people after him, and seeing that the people got sent after David should have been proof enough that Saul wanted to kill David. I mean, the story again doesn't say explicitly what David's state of mind was, but I think it's a bigger reach to say David was a conniver than David was a trusted
All right.
person.
Let me ask you a different question then,
That
Mike.
doesn't mean it's not possible. I just think it's a bigger
All right.
reach.
As a result of Saul's, when Jonathan goes to his father, and when Jonathan openly confronts his father in the court in front of the other court officials on the new moon, and his father says to him, when Jonathan reveals that he has allowed David to go back to his family home on the pretext of offering a family sacrifice, and Saul becomes enraged and says, "You worthless son of a such and such, you've let this enemy go. Don't you have any, realize he's a danger to you and to your kingship?" What is the result of Saul's reaction on Jonathan? What has that succeeded in doing to Jonathan, Michael?
Well, that strengthens John, that informs Jonathan that he's really happy. But so as far as, I mean, if David really left to be with his, then Jonathan would have still said the same thing to Saul, and the same reaction still would have happened, and the same amount of convincing would have happened.
Right.
But David would have had a head start,
You see,
and he could have executed his plan earlier.
Yes, he could. Yes, he could have, but maybe he felt that to convince his friend Jonathan, the legal heir to the throne, that he was not mistaken, to convince his friend Jonathan that Jonathan's father Saul had homicidal intentions toward David. Maybe it was worth it for David to postpone his departure and postpone his further plans for the sake of proving to Jonathan conclusively, even if just to Jonathan, that there was no reconciliation possible between himself and David, between David and Saul. Okay, maybe that was the point, that Jonathan finally realizes that with whatever comes, his father is in the wrong and David is in the right. Jonathan will not join in any of Saul's attempts to hunt down David. As you come to the end of the book of Samuel 1, Saul will go out against Jonathan a number of times, but Jonathan never participates in those raids. In fact, he comes to David one more time, you will see, to warn him of his father. So David has bought, by this ruse, if you want, or by this test, he has bought a valuable ally in the court. David has in the court Jonathan. What has it cost him? Merely postponing his departure. Now Jonathan knows that David is right. Go ahead, Michael.
But so here's again where I have the problem. If David really departed, Jonathan would have really told Saul that David departed, which is what he told Saul anyway.
Right.
And Saul would have still had the same reaction, because Saul doesn't know David's hiding.
Right.
So and Jonathan would have seen the same thing.
Yes,
So
but
he would
remember,
have seen the same thing out of his father.
yes, but remember that the two of them made an agreement. Jonathan and David had agreed that following this altercation, that Jonathan would report back to David. If David hadn't waited for Jonathan's report, if David had just fled knowing what Jonathan would find out, then Jonathan and David would not have had that last important meeting when essentially Jonathan says to David, "You were right. My dad has decided to kill you. You are right. He is not. I know now that you are destined to have the kingship of Israel and not him." In other words, yes, it would have been the same, but because the two men had agreed to meet, David was bound to meet there and to receive the final word from Jonathan. There was always the possibility that maybe David was misreading the singles. I don't think he was. I think David knew exactly what Saul wanted. Could Jonathan have repaired the damage? I don't think so. But if Jonathan had reported back to David, truthfully, I've managed to heal the breach, maybe David would have believed it. I don't know. But at least by waiting, and at least by waiting for Jonathan to come back and to say goodbye to David, and for the two young men to embrace one final time, and Jonathan to say, whatever happens, my pact with you and your pact with me will continue on through our generations. It strengthens that tie. Go ahead, Jerry, you had a comment.
Saul is still trying to get David through stealth, not
Yes.
to harm him outright.
Correct.
Yet now David's got the advantage of having Jonathan in his pocket, so to speak. He's got Jonathan's sister, Saul's daughter, in his pocket. So now David is even more stealthy. So he can use that to his advantage. This is where I think David shows his real political acumen.
Yeah, well, it doesn't work out, as you'll see, quite that way. Saul takes David's wife and marries her off to another man. As you're going to see, he takes Michal and he uses David's abandonment, his rebellion, supposedly against Saul. He uses that as an excuse to give Michal to another man. As far as Jonathan goes, I doubt Jonathan ever says another word to his father on David's behalf. But you are right, Jerry. Jonathan is in the court, and we do know that Jonathan comes to David once again before the two meet again, where Jonathan warns David. So David does have an ace in the hole in the court in the sense that he does have Jonathan there. So that is to his advantage. But Jonathan is going to be of limited help to David now, because if Jonathan speaks up anymore from this point on behalf of David, there is no doubt that Saul would have had him killed. And by the way, Saul had other sons. It wasn't only Jonathan. Jonathan was the heir apparent, but Saul had two other sons as well. If he had become angry at Jonathan for whatever reason, he could have appointed another son as the heir designate. So to watch himself afterward, but I think there was an advantage to David in keeping him there. All right, look. I'm not suggesting, and Michael, I don't mean to make the case that David was a scoundrel, although there are episodes in the next part of what we're going to see in David's life that give me even more pause. David does some things that, if he's not a conniver, he's a very savvy political player. And he takes every single lesson he learned in life and he uses it to his advantage later on, even duplicating things. He will connive people into meeting with him and make statements to other people that will get his enemies killed, even though he never said a word and claims he never asked for it to be done. And then he'll execute the one who executed the person who was his adversary. He's amazing. So when I say conniver, and believe me, this hurts me because David is a great man in Israel, and yet he is, if he's not a conniver, he is politically very sophisticated. He plays the game better than any other political leader I've ever seen in my life. And I'll try and show you when we continue that's how David was throughout his life. All right. Any other comments, questions, counter sermons, anything else to add at this point? All right. Well, with the
Coco's here for her bar mitzvah.
Bar mitzvah, I see. We have one dog, and the face on this dog affirms that I have got it correct. Whatever you all may think, Arlene and Jerry's dog is smiling at me, is saying, "You've got him right, Reb." No, I'm kidding. Look,
All dogs to sleep.
well, yeah, I can put dogs and people to sleep.
Mine's under the bed again.
As a matter of fact, I do that all the time on the high holidays. At the end of my high holiday sermon, I say, how many of you liked it? And all the hands go up and I say, I fooled you. I didn't give a sermon. You were all asleep.
Oh, gee.
No, I didn't. Anyway, we are now in recess. All right. Unless you are in the book of Exodus, when we will come together on Monday, last and final session of our Exodus class. So I will send you out information. this, we will post this video. And then I will be sending out shortly thereafter, because I'm already deep in planning for the new semester. We've got some other ideas for new classes, new approaches. I won't say anything more because my wife always says I sell programs before they're fully developed. And so she doesn't want me to prepackage these programs, so I'll wait. But at any rate, we're already coming up with some new ideas. There will be some ongoing classes again. There will be some one-shot special discussions. There will be some more outside speakers. So we're going to do a kind of a combination of what we've done so far and throw in a couple of new things too. We want to constantly be changing things around a little bit. But sometime I'm going to be leaving. We're going to be leaving here for our son-in-law and our daughter-in-law, for our son and our daughter-in-law in July. We're going to be new grandparents. We're going up for the bris. So hopefully sometime before we leave in July, I will send you out the schedule of the fall semester classes and give you an idea of what's coming up and begin to prepare. Yes. Oh, thank you, Randy. I do want to remind you, after I'm doing something this coming Monday, but the following Sunday, Sam is doing a course. He's doing a course. I'll send this to you too. Supermarket kashrut. Okay. You're faced with the problem. You've got to go to a minyan and you want to bring the mourner food, but you don't know what to bring to the mourner's house because the mourner keeps kosher. Can you go anywhere? Can you get anything? You want to go to the supermarket. What can you find in the supermarket? Or you've been invited for a Shabbos lunch or Shabbos dinner, and you want to bring something, a gift of food to the family's house. What can you bring? Or you have a friend who's coming over to your house who's who's observant of kashrut, and you want to prepare a meal, and you want to know what you can do for him, but maybe you don't have a kosher specialty shop near you. Can you go to the store? And if you do, what do you look for and how do you go shopping? So Sam is running this one session course called Supermarket Kashrut, and that will be a week from this Sunday. It will be a week from Sunday after my Monday class, and that will be the last class of the session. So I'll let you know about that too. All right, everybody, enjoy.
Hi.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Feel
You're-
better, Rabbi.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm a little under the weather. You for my voice. Okay.
I could tell.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Good
Feel
night.
better soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah.